Well, welcome all. The clock has struck noon, and we are excited to get started with our gathering on science and liberalism, featuring Isabel Gabel, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institution on the Formation of Knowledge. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago. And I welcome you virtually to our campus where big ideas are born that challenge and change the world. It is actually quite cloudy and rainy. So you can imagine this picture, but just with a little bit more moisture, but still as vibrant and full of ideas as ever. For those of you who are not familiar, we at the Graham School are the home of the University of Chicago's lifelong learning. And since the founding of the university, we have been here to make sure that the big ideas that are a part of this university and the extraordinary people like Isabel are bringing their ideas to people across all ages and stages of their lives. And we are passionate about how the lifelong liberal arts can really help us to constantly see into greater meaning in the world and to live examined lives of purpose. And we're incredibly grateful to have all of you joining us in that mission today. And I see many familiar faces who join us in that mission now for decades. And I'll just share for those of you who are not familiar, there are 4 programmatic verticals through which we carry out that mission of expanding the lifelong liberal arts. The first is a Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the world. We have a basic program of liberal education where you can go deep into the great books that have really formed the core of Western civilization. And I will say more to come because we have an Asian classic sequence and some others that are going to be launching out of that basic program in the years ahead. We have open enrollment where we find classes like the one that you're about to hear about on science and liberalism. And that is an opportunity to see across all of the disciplines of the university. And then we have annual programs. And I'll mention that we just finished having a national gathering of museum publishers who are interested in how they bring their ideas to lifelong learners, as well as a group of judges who were competing in this kind of world of how do we use the lifelong liberal arts to think differently about justice. And later this week, we will have a large gathering called Know Your Chicago, a symposium led by a committee of women who have built out a really phenomenal vision for how we engage in Chicago that has been going on now for more than 70 years and that we are thrilled to be a partner with through our annual programs. So a very busy time, but let me stop sharing my screen because the reason that you are all here today is to have a conversation with Isabel Gabel, who is a historian of science and political thought in the 20th century. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge at the University of Chicago. From 2018 to 2021, she was a postdoc in ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics and genomics in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy, and a visiting scholar in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to her time at Penn, she was a postdoctoral fellow in conceptual and historical studies of science and the Department of History here at the University of Chicago. And I should just close by saying she received her PhD in history from Columbia University. Welcome, Isabel. We are grateful for this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start because when I first saw this proposal, around science and liberalism, I was intrigued because I hadn't fully noticed the connection. And now we've had a couple conversations. I do see it, but I want to make sure everyone else here sees it. And so you're a historian of science, medicine, and political thought. And I'm curious, kind of, how did you get the idea to teach this course? And how have you been able to kind of see the connections between these two ideas, science and liberalism, that we might initially think of as worlds apart?
So I liked that you opened by saying that you didn't see the connection, because I think or that it wasn't obvious until you thought about it, because part of why I want to teach this class is that I think the connection is almost so obvious we don't see it. So like one of my immediate motivations for first developing this course came out of the kind of political moment of 2020 and this perception, both the election of 2020 and this perception that there was sort of like science was on the line in this election. and that there was a sort of threat to liberal democratic institutions. And there was language around believe science, choose science as a kind of like return to normalcy and a return to liberal democratic institutions that was coming from the Democratic Party and from the Biden campaign. And that kind of was that was sort of a hook that got me interested in teaching a class that looked into the history of the connection between sort of like saving liberalism and faith in science or believing in science. But it also really suited my research interests because as you mentioned, I work both sort of in the history of political thought and in the history of science. And my research does kind of look at some of the more hidden moments in this history and how it is that liberal values get kind of draw on scientific values, draw on scientific facts, draw on scientific ways of knowing. And so really what I wanted to do was, having gone through that moment and having all gone through this big public health campaign about vaccines and doubts about vaccines, think about whether a kind of course interrogating both the political and the scientific history in a long 20th century perspective could just bring a little more nuance to conversations about that relationship instead of it feeling like a kind of polarizing choice.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And as we talked, I began to realize that this relationship has been through a number of recent periods in terms of, different influences and ways in which scientific discovery and liberalism have kind of been viewing one another in a certain sense. And so, in our prep call, we talked about how this really takes a new form after the Second World War. And then you come into the 60s and you have the civil rights movement and other kind of major kind of revelations that lead us into another era. And then you come into the modern era where we're talking about, very digital and artificial intelligence. And so maybe we can walk through each of those and kind of look at how they transition and shape. And so I want to start because I just want to set the foundation before the Second World War. And how would you describe the relationship beforehand? And then we'll come to after, because obviously that is a major moment in science with the bomb and other related activities.
So yeah, I mean, we spend only a small, maybe like 1 week on the sort of pre-war era. And of course, this is all going to be very, very oversimplified, but one way to think about it is just that I would say at least until the First World War and or the Second World War, there was really a very obvious alliance between sort of scientific knowledge and human progress, right? So the ideas of the Enlightenment in practice, the idea that human reason, human ingenuity was going to bring social progress, was going to like bring human perfectibility closer and closer to its apex. And alongside that, of course, a faith in human progress, which I think, many people are familiar with the idea that the Second World War in the West, that the First World War in the West was a big kind of crisis moment. And you have, Spengler and the decline of the West. You have that, like in 1918, you have a kind of loss of faith in progress after the First World War. And I think the Second World War really solidifies the relationship between that crisis of the idea of progress in Europe and America and a kind of crisis about what science is. Is it really an engine of progress or is it not? So I think we'll spend a little time, I think, thinking about the very early 20th century and how science was a kind of engine of liberalism because it was seen as both a kind of like reflection of human reason, a reflection of human capacity for freedom, for individuality, for perhaps taking a little distance from religious authority, a kind of democratization of authority. And like cultivating a relationship to the sciences was a way of building a community around something other than just religion or nationality. And not to say that those weren't important, right? But it was this other form of sort of progressive community making and progressive consensus making. And that, as you alluded to, gets really problematized with the two world wars.
Well, so let's jump into that because there's the sense that science is human progress until at least the First World War, and then afterward there are a lot of questions. And so I'm curious, maybe if you could talk a little bit about what was it, even though it may be obvious, about the world wars that may have
Yeah.
disrupted that viewpoint that science is only going to enable progress, and then what is the view afterward? Because I imagine people don't say there's no progress, but it's a more complicated picture. And so how do people begin to grapple with this interconnection in a more complex setting?
So I mean, there's this immediate feeling around both like the bomb, like the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the invention of the atom bomb as this like, it's an existential threat to humanity that emerges out of also one of the greatest scientific achievements imaginable. I mean, this unlocking of something totally awesome about the physical world,
Yeah.
that physicists had achieved, that is like just inextricably linked from absolute mass murder and misery. And parallel to that, of course, you have the turning of eugenics, which was actually kind of thought was a kind of way of thinking about progress that we now are critical of, right? But eugenics takes this very violent, murderous turn in the Nazi regime, right? So there, and that's just like, those are just two of them. I mean, you also have, of course, like technologies of warfare and in the First World War, and that also kind of lead people to question, like, is technology always progress, right? Because it seems to be violent and aid in a lot of death. So there's a kind of, in that immediate post-war period, there emerge a lot of critical reflections on the relationship between science and technology and sort of violence. We'll read, and this course does have, like, again, it's very compressed, so we read a little bit about that. And that, again, that's a crisis for the kind of legitimacy of science, or like the pure faith in science, but it also, I think, raises a question of like what can be the foundation of a liberal society if it's going to be a pluralist society that respects individual freedom. So in other words, it's not a religious authority, it's not an authoritarian nationalist regime, but if science can't be the thing that kind of like neutrally offers a kind of common ground for a liberal society because it has all this violence within it, there becomes a kind of political theoretical question that emerges out of this this sort of new anxiety about science.
Well, and so there is that kind of anxiety. And I think, as I have heard from you, that kind of continues into the 60s. And so there's kind of this debate taking place. And then, we all think of, especially in the US, the 60s beginning another major transformation in social thought, a huge break with the way that we thought about the world in the 50s, a lot of cracking of the ways that we think about, America in really healthy and important ways. And there's also extraordinary scientific progress in this moment. So, this is when Apollo 11 happens and we're landing on the moon by the end of that decade. How is our understanding of science and political thought changing in this period? And what are some of the readings that you're looking at to kind of dig into this relationship during this moment in time?
So yeah, I think the 60s are a moment when in addition to this sort of immediate post-war critique of technology, you also, as you mentioned, you get the civil rights movement, you get decolonization, you get new forms of awareness about sort of critiques of universality and new forms of awareness about like other ways of knowing, other forms of knowledge making, both in the sense of like these political pushback of decolonization and also in scholarly reflections on those moments. So I think one text we read in this vein is Paul Feyerabend's Against Method, which is from 72, I think. I think that's the first edition, which is really a kind of, I mean, it's a very provocative attempt to argue against the idea that science actually, not just to say there are other ways of doing things, but his critique is to say science is actually much more pluralistic, much more chaotic, much more ad hoc than philosophers of science have really admitted up to now. But he's very explicitly drawing on a humanitarian outlook as a motivation for making this argument, and explicitly now connecting the kind of sort of whitewashed universalism of a kind of Western scientific outlook to the kind of obliteration of cultural difference, right? So it's not just about literal violence, but about learning from and thinking with other cultures. And that, I would say, is something that emerges in the 60s, even though, as you point out, there's totally awesome progress. I mean, you mentioned the moon landing, but like there's also genetics.
Right.
I mean, genetics is sort of starts in the 50s, but it really takes off in the 60s and totally changes how people think about what it is to be a biological being. This is the class I taught last year, but it connects.
Well, so I'm going to come now to our moment, and we have continued to see really disruptive technological advancement, and digital just begins to capture it in terms of the internet, the proliferation of social media. Now, obviously, on the cusp of fully realizing artificial intelligence as a kind of core element in our world. And as we have been in this moment, we have seen, in some ways, an untethering to facts. And because of how much information is out there, the very real possibility that obviously has always existed and that is human in nature, but that is being accelerated, which is the possibility that people even have trouble deciphering what's real and what's not, right? Whether that is in the artificial form, or whether that is just in our ability to kind of engage with facts and understand what is fact and fiction in our political lives. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, what this looks like, and how you think about, this moment and what you see the relationship being today between science and liberalism.
So I think before saying what I think, I would say part of my goal for the class is actually to get past the idea that there's an obvious line between this is scientific, this is not scientific, right? So we have this fear now about, or many people have a fear about kind of post-truth or the kind of erosion of truth. And my question is, can we think more carefully about what that even was before this moment, right? What does it mean? What kinds of authority do we think count as scientific? And why, and then also by the same token, why is it that, for example, with the anti-vaccine movement, or more specifically, the anti-COVID vaccine and anti-lockdown movements during the height of the COVID pandemic did seem to kind of bring together a far left and a far right position. In other words, a kind of like right-wing populist and sort of like left communist or anarchist hostility to a kind of like authoritarian vision of state science, right? That's how it's perceived on both of those ends of the spectrum. And so the question is sort of like, what is the vision of science that's being fought for? And is it really so black and white as this is anti-science and then science is this sort of stable authority that we can just defend knowing what it is? So I think it's not to say that there's no problem so much as to say I think we sometimes misunderstand the problem when we think it's a simple matter to say believe the science. In terms of what I think, I mean, I think that part of the problem is literally what you said at the opening, which is it hadn't occurred to you, not that the problem is individuals, but that it hadn't occurred to you that there's a relationship between science and liberalism. And I think that actually gets to a core reason why this has bubbled up into like a big divisive political problem in this country and some others, is that it's almost so baked into our political norms to a sort of assume that these scientific institutions and these government, like liberal political institutions, are seamlessly work together. And the idea that there could be any friction between liberal political values and scientific values needs to be addressed, or needs to be thought through if we want to have a better conversation about it. So I think that's my normative goal, is to get us, whoever's in the seminar, right, to think together more carefully about the relationship between those liberal institutional norms and what it is that we really value about science, which is a lot, right? So can we be more specific and thoughtful about the history of these two things?
Is it fair to say that what you're also saying is that, part of the country, for example, in the US, will view science in that political framework? And so just to come back to this example of the vaccine, I sit in a world where the NIH says, this is what you should be doing. And I look at that as almost fact, like, scientists say this, and, these are scientists, they are just objectively interpreting the world. Someone else in the country is looking at that and they're seeing that as a political act in some ways. And they're saying, this is highly political, which is maybe a fair way because it's government doing it, right? And potentially enforcing it. And so we're seeing these actions with different authority types, right? I'm seeing this as just a scientific discovery, and someone else is seeing this as a political act. And then we don't even understand how we're disagreeing with each other, because I look and I say, well, how couldn't someone agree with science? And someone else is saying, how do they think they have the authority to do this in my social contract? And so not seeing these as part of the same conversation, we're having two separate conversations and we can't even talk to one another potentially. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but I feel that way sometimes when I even look in the mirror and I realize some of my own biases and ways of seeing things that may be very different than how someone else in the country is viewing these same discoveries or decisions.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, because I think that within academia and within science studies scholarship, we often think that we know how to make the distinction between that's a fact and that's a value, right? But of course, people across the values divide have a different way of distinguishing between a fact and a value, exactly as you just stated, that there would be people who would see an NIH recommendation or a mandate, right, masks or vaccine from the CDC as a kind of political encroachment. And the fact is, like, I mean, this isn't very much, this is very much informed by my experience you mentioned in the medical ethics department at Penn, that the fact is that, like, there is a tension between this primary value of autonomy and of, the right to believe what you believe, and also some degree of valuing like political and bodily autonomy in a liberal society, and the kind of needs of public health is one of this, the needs of public health. If we are really a society, perhaps there are moments when there is a greater authority than your personal autonomy, but that is political, not just scientific.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's not that this course is not at all primarily focused on the question of vaccines. There's 1 week at the end about the contemporary situation, but it's really that I think it's really valuable for me, just rereading these texts, and for my students when I taught this class last year, I just think it's like enriching to have a little bit more just historical context and nuance to how we think about these issues that can feel very heated and high stakes for our contemporary political world.
Well, so I want to get questions from our audience, so please chat them in, or feel free to raise your hands using the reactions tab. If you press on it, you can press raise hand. We can come and call on you directly to ask your question to Isabel. I'll ask one more before we jump over to the Q&A with our audience. This is a huge topic. You're going to look across decades of time. We're all still trying to sort out in the moment right now how we make sense of these interconnections. How will you approach teaching a course that is both evolving in nature, because it's such a key idea that we're trying to sort out, and that is so huge that you're across multiple disciplines, you're across a significant time period? Yeah, tell us about your syllabus and how you'll approach the classroom itself in terms of the learning experience.
So my approach to the syllabus, in general, my approach to syllabi is I try to always assign things that whether or not I agree with them, I think are really worth reading and rereading. Sort of, I come from, again, like history of political thought, intellectual history. So everything I assign almost without exception is something that I think at the basis of like the text is worth careful, like close reading and rewards time and discussion and rereading. So that's just like a bare minimum for me, a bar that texts have to clear before I really want to assign them to students. But also, yes, as you say, it's a really broad question across a lot of time. And so to some degree, there's some like a few greatest hits pulled from these questions. So we read Karl Popper just to get like a kind of very canonical, foundational theory of science, of the philosophy of science, and then to set up the Feyerabend, for example, which is, I believe, the next week. But then we also read some important texts from the 70s, I think, on questions of like truth and lying in politics to try to sort of connect think about any connections between the idea of, any obligation to speak truth in a political context and the sort of authority that science has to discern truth or facts and falsehood or refute facts. So there's that kind of orientation towards these like major texts in the 20th century, but again, it is across several fields, so it's by necessity pretty idiosyncratic. And I would have almost said there's a bias towards the fact that I'm interested in the life sciences, but honestly, there isn't much directly drawn from the life sciences, except perhaps in my focus on this problematic of autonomy and authority, which comes from my interest in bioethics, right? Where that's sort of a central tension is like the authority of the medical establishment of the doctor, but also the value of autonomy, and how I think I am very interested in how that translates into the political realm. So that's sort of a structuring question. My approach to the classroom, I mean, I think you essentially, I assign texts that I think are worth reading and worth having read, right? To have in your wheelhouse of things you've read. But my focus is always less on pure content mastery, although anybody who's in my class, we pay very close attention to like a paragraph at a time sometimes. But my motivation is in getting people to feel like they can then have a richer conversation about these topics in their lives afterwards. And so actually like that's my approach to the seminar too, is like, let's have a conversation where we bring our perspectives and these texts to each other and try to have the best possible conversation we can about something that's really challenging.
Well, so we've gotten great questions in the chat. I'll start with Robert Pierce's. Richard Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. Are you familiar with that book? And is that discussed in your course at all?
It is not discussed in my course at all, but it could be. I know of that book, but I actually have not read it. This course is not particularly focused on the US, even though I framed the question via COVID stuff. I mean, it's actually, I should have said, there's kind of a European tilt because my background is in European intellectual history. So we touch on things that happen in the US and we read some American scholars. But that does actually point out the fact that this is not a US. Yeah.
To this idea of anti-intellectualism, because that's not a US only phenomenon. No. And just kind of the rise of anti-intellectualism, in the last couple of decades, there's, and this is, I realize, controversial, but one could make the argument that there's some connection to, Trump in politics, but there are many other leaders, if we look at other countries, that also resemble, at least according to scholars, some of that anti-intellectualism. And so I'm curious if you could just talk to how the, kind of connections between science and liberalism, or disconnects in some ways, may be influencing that anti-intellectualism.
So yeah, that will, part of where that emerges, but both for me and in this course, is in a question that comes up, I think it's like the second to last week or sort of towards the end of the course. In like the beginning of the millennium, like around Bush's election and the lead up to the war in Iraq, was another big moment both in the American political culture and in academia for sort of wondering about the erosion of truth in public. Like, have we lost all touch with the idea of truth because there were so many lies that led to the invasion of Iraq? And there is a lot of introspection that happens among academics that might be familiar to people now about whether or not the kind of critical practices that academics had developed to sort of think critically about science, to those forms of critique developed by people like Foucault or Feyerabend, right, who were responding to the negative authority of science, whether that had sort of gotten out of hand and led to this anti-intellectualism more broadly and led to this sort of like bad kind of anti-authoritarianism or anti-intellectualism that certainly connects up with Trump. So I actually see a pretty direct parallel in US political culture between that kind of like Iraq war invasion anxiety and the 2020 election, because of this perception that truth is the threat and that's what has to be voted on, is this the kind of safety of truth.
We have a comment and question here from Maria Pardo. I consider both science and liberal political values the foundation of a democratic society. Building on Professor Gabel's remarks, I think that they go together, but are in tension at one point. Trust/mistrust in expertise. Liberal thought is anti-authoritarian. Scientific thought relies on expertise and thus on the authority of specialists. When the non-specialists can't agree, and our decisions affect each other, how do we develop practical decision-making rules of thumb?
That's really beautifully put. And how do we develop practical decision-making rules of thumb? I mean, that's like, I would have to be both very confident and a political theorist, active political theorist to make that kind of like, develop new techniques of democratic decision-making. But I think that, I mean, one of the, and maybe this isn't a rule of thumb, but one of the things that I think is very important is to get a better handle on what we mean by uncertainty, because there is, as people are probably familiar with, a way in which uncertainty in the sciences can get weaponized against finding political solutions, whether that's about climate change, or decades ago about the link between smoking and cancer, or about vaccines, right? When they're new, there's lots of things we don't know, and that gets weaponized against the idea that they should be adopted. And I think that reflects a kind of binary way of thinking about certainty and uncertainty, and the idea that uncertainty is the death of science, whereas in fact, uncertainty is actually central to what science is. And it's a matter of really careful and collaborative thinking about uncertainty. So rather than a rule of thumb for decision making, I would say that would be a kind of value that I would push for more attention to.
I mean, to Maria's questions, are there historical examples, coming back to your expertise, where you've seen society, so to speak, get this right, where they've gone through a moment like COVID, where to the point, made in Maria's example, there is this tension and this inherent liberal thought is anti-authoritarian and science is, expertise, but they've been able to find a way, to advance the needed work that science is recommending, more successfully. I mean, are there even examples, and this would be more a question for all of us, but, where they were able to make the COVID science more effective? I mean, for example, Europe had much higher uptakes on some of these things than the US did, like, the COVID vaccine. And so I don't know if any of those things might be interesting to look at, but it'd be interesting to look at how does the tension play out, and in a place where maybe there's less tension, do you have more success in scientific recommendations being able to reach broader groups of people? Yeah, what are your just reactions on that front?
I think that I wouldn't say that there's like an example where there's just been a state, like or a country where that problem is generally fully diffused. But what I'm trying to do is think of examples where scientific practice itself can be at sometimes more democratized.
Yeah.
And whether that's about like, citizen science, which I don't know very much about, but is a really rich area of scholarship, or even like sort of this diffusion of expertise into communities and certain and like more actively. I'm thinking even about like women's health activists, right, who in the absence of um, the authority of the medical, like the central authority of like medical practice supporting them, like just took it upon themselves while also subscribing to scientific norms of safety and of evidence. So I think I don't know that there's like one
right answer.
that we have like a model that just solves the problem, but I think that there are many ways to kind of have a diffuse what we have in this country or have seen in this country recently, which is like a total and complete suspicion of everything that comes from the CDC, which again I think is the source of that crisis was multiple. It was not just the CDC did a bad piece of communication or people are dumb, right? It's not one or the other.
Stephen has a question in the chat. I always wonder if fact checkers are being objective, or do they base their evaluation on a certain portion of the narrative that supports the answer they want to give? And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about the rise of fact checking, which is, I think, a more recent phenomenon. And, it's essentially being used by a lot of media in particular to try to hold on to their role as truth keepers, even as there's been this, if you look at the polling data, immense loss of trust in institutions and journalism, despite a lot of great journalists out there.
Well, I think, I mean, there may be a rise of fact checking in some dimensions, but there's also a decline of fact checking in parts of publishing, for example, because publishing is so under resourced. So a lot of nonfiction books that get published, like academic books, don't get fact checked. Just to put it out there, like they get peer reviewed, which is not the same. So there's also a kind of decline of it because so few of these media and publishing companies have the resources. But I think what fact checking can do, if done well, is highlight not necessarily consensus, but the idea that a kind of like a good faith survey of everything available to a normal person, right? This appears to be correct. It's not just being inserted by the author, but it can't, and I think that does have a parallel to what scientific consensus is, because scientific consensus is never full consensus. It is just some version of democracy, right? Not a perfect version, but some version of, because there's not like a one-to-one vote, right? But it's I don't know much about fact checking. I just know that there's actually not. My impression is that there's less of it than there used to be, not more. Unless you mean like websites that specifically fact check like what a candidate said, which maybe is a new phenomenon.
Yeah, I think
Like
that's where a lot of lay people are seeing it is speech by a political leader, and CNN afterward has an explicit fact checking section where they go through
right.
What here was true, what here wasn't. I think that particular piece is a recent phenomenon, I think, responding to the fact that there may be an untethering in some of these worlds at a higher degree. There's always obviously been lies in politics, from those things, and the fact that we now have more ability to actually check in the moment. I think that's the other, is that it may have been hard
right.
to get facts to even, if Kennedy or whoever it was said something, like you may not have easily been able to react. And now, instantaneously you can kind of find at least what you believe to be the data and, try to come at it in terms of an investigation from a data lens. I know we're running out of time with you, Isabel. Let me ask you maybe the hardest question, save the best for last here. So students are going to go through this. They're going to read across time and space how these two disciplines have kind of interacted with one another. They're going to see kind of how we over time have viewed scientific progress and how that's affected our way of looking at trust, facts, all these things. How do you think that may influence the way that they interact with the world? So I think what you're doing is you're giving this kind of like foundation. And I mean, every day now we are bombarded by this tension, right? I mean, I feel like we're living in this tension for anyone who's a citizen and who's engaging and reading media and thinking about, and in the many forms of social media where these things are kind of at play, right? Whether it's, how should Elon Musk handle these things at Twitter, or like, how do you think that being a part of this class will help to just provide a kind of toolkit for thinking about these issues? I realize you're not going to give people answers to what's right or wrong, but how will it help people around how to think about these dimensions?
So I mean, my hope is that it will help all of us, and I include myself, rereading these things, right? I'm always trying to get further in the direction of not seeing the question of science versus non-science, or like as totally black and white. And what I mean by that is, even in like the most rarefied academic context, there can be this like divide between people who really are like, this is what science is, it's the most fact-based discipline we have, and people who are very invested in a kind of like extremely valuable political and moral critique of that authority of science. And it often seems like even in academia, we can't always talk across that divide. And that doesn't, to me, bode well for the ability of a political culture to not stay fully divided and think, well, that person's a complete idiot because they don't understand how safe the vaccine is, or that person's a complete idiot because they took the vaccine. So if anything, I just hope it makes the problem that we're living through more interesting like more interesting, more worthy of reflection and not just reaction. And I don't know, I mean, some of us have people in our lives that are across this divide. And again, this is not a class, we're reading like, big texts from European thought and science, but I still hope that it could, especially the conversations we have in seminar, can inform how we all interact with, people who fall on different sides of this than us, and perhaps bring us somewhere to a place of more complexity on it, which is not to say that everybody starts out super dogmatic, but I think that the political culture pushes us towards dogmatism on these questions, and I want to push back on that a bit.
Well, so we do have one last question that I want to get to
Okay.
in our chat from Greg Thompson, and I'll read it. It's a significant one. I wonder if you could speak to how what is right and true can be mistaken, and how that can affect those who were skeptical from the beginning. Consider the lab leak hypothesis of COVID. I'm no true believer in this hypothesis, but it does seem to me that there has been sufficient support for this hypothesis to make it at least plausible. But differently, isn't skepticism also a fundamental value of classic liberalism? Although I'm not conservative, I have to say that the conservative critique of liberals for being insufficiently skeptical of authority seems to have some merit. Their argument is simple. Too often, liberals, politically speaking, are too quick to accept what the authorities say, such that truth becomes more of a matter of knowing what the right political position is rather than facts. I'm just going to give you a chance to respond to that idea of how, this may be impacting our sense of truth in this moment.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very well put. I think what I can say quickly to that is that I think I largely agree, and that I think that gets to what I was saying about bringing more the goal of the course, because I agree that a kind of like a knee-jerk defense of like, well, this is the science, which in our current era comes from a kind of like liberal/democratic party like aligned position, not only is politically divisive, but ultimately undermines the ability to have a kind of shared vision of what scientific truth might be, because that's false. Like that's sort of when I said about bringing uncertainty forward as a kind of political and epistemological value, or a form of epistemological modesty, which is not to say we don't act and try to improve the world, like not this sort of fake modesty of, well, there's two scientists that say climate change is fake, so we shouldn't do anything, but like a genuine form of cultivating modesty and a sense of uncertainty as built into both science and political decision making.
Well, this has been a thrilling discussion, because I think you've brought to the fore so many things that we are feeling and seeing. I even think when you said, Isabel, earlier that, science is democratic, I'm thinking about just, during COVID, seeing the FDA panel and then, these different CDC panels go through and you realize, oh, not everyone is, in total agreement. They may all ultimately recommend, aspects of this, but there may be gradations of gray across this. And, science is not black and white, right? And so what does that mean? And how does that then play out in our lives? And how can we bring that nuance into a political sphere that often, requires simplification in a way that is true to form and that allows all of us to hopefully be tethered to what facts may exist and then where they may not, but where there may be very hearty recommendations. Your class seems like a great way to at least begin that journey of figuring out how to navigate that balance. And we're incredibly grateful that you're teaching it at Graham and really excited for an autumn of discovery. I'll just give you the last word here before we close.
Well, I'll just say I'm really very excited to teach this class, which I'm updating a bit from the last time I taught it. And I love the text, and I'm really looking forward to our meetings.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. Thank you all for joining us. Happy afternoon, and stay dry for those who are here in Chicago. Bye all.